Welcome to Stay Ready so you don't have to get ready. Planning and preparation for crisis states with serious mental illness. I'm your presenter and facilitator, Ty Taylor. My allergies are acting up, so excuse me if I have the sniffles today. All right, so to introduce myself, hi everyone, I'm Ty Taylor, a Black femme who is non-binary, trans, and queer. I'm a literary artist and radical educator from upstate New York. My practices are informed by disability justice and abolition. I have been diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder, generalized anxiety, ADHD, and complex PTSD. I identify with all of these diagnoses. I also identify as as autistic. I'm a psych survivor who has survived 10 psychiatric hospitalizations across 10 years. Okay, so just to go over the agenda for tonight, introduction, which I just gave, terms and definitions, serious, oops, that's supposed to say serious mental illness as a marginalization, rationale and strategy, discussing mental illness with others, hospitalization, alternatives, and long-term support. So I wanted to start by grounding us in some disability justice theory. Please forgive me for butchering their name, but I actually haven't heard it said aloud before. I have a name that's difficult to pronounce, so I feel even worse about butchering this name. But the first quote is, "My central act of resistance is to keep myself alive." Leah Lakshmi, this is where it gets hard for me. Piepsna Samarasana, cripping the resistance, no revolution without us. And for me, it's important to start off with this quote because although there are different feelings about having a workshop that focuses on how to navigate the system, it's not that I'm in support of the system. It's not that I'm upholding these systems. I am, very marginalized myself. I identify as having a serious mental illness. It's not to push my beliefs on anyone else, but to focus on how I've been able to successfully keep myself alive. It's been very difficult to do such with serious mental illness, but I want to share the wisdom that has come from me trying so hard to keep myself alive, to share that wisdom with y'all, and hopefully it's its own resource. From the same article, Cripping the Resistance, No Revolution Without Us, make crip resistant soup out of whatever skills, resources, tactics, and brilliant wild crip ideas you possess. For me, that includes writing essays and poetry and tools, checking in on my friends, cracking jokes, and being there to witness, doing things that are often underground and not visible on social media, prayer and ritual, and believing in us. And I identify with all of these practices. And I'm inviting, this isn't just an invitation for myself, this is an invitation for everyone out there to make crip resistant soup out of whatever we have available. And to know as well, or to highlight that surviving is sometimes just making the best of what you have available. As us hoodoos say, making a way out of no way. And that's perfectly fine, however, we're able to show up. Terms and definitions. I want to get into some terms around the topic of preparing for crisis states so that we can, know about the officiality and legality of these terms because we're having to live under society that administers these terms and recognizes them. So it's kind of a way of familiarizing ourselves with the resources available in this presentation. And I will give the public link at the end so everyone can access this presentation as a resource. It's a way to interact with these resources together and to set up the platform where we are more informed. Okay, so mental illness. Mental illness is typically separated into two categories, any mental illness, or AMI, and serious mental illness, SMI. I'm just defining these terms because these are used regularly. I'm not diagnosing anyone or putting this label on anyone else. I do identify as having a serious mental illness. Any mental illness, AMI, is defined as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. AMI can vary in impact, ranging from no impairment to mild, moderate, and even severe impairment. For example, individuals with serious mental illness, as defined below. Serious mental illness, SMI, is defined as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. The burden of mental illness is particularly concentrated among those who experience disability due to SMI. So I do identify as disabled because I live with bipolar 1 disorder as well as complex PTSD. I welcome people to embrace the label if it's helpful for them. Identifying as disabled has helped me to identify with community, helped me to think about my CRIP wisdom, has gotten me deeper into disability justice, and has really allowed me to think about serious mental illness as a marginalization and overcoming ableism. Crisis. This is from the Icarus Project. The word crisis comes from a root meaning judgment. A crisis is a moment of great tension and meeting the unknown. It's a turning point when things can't go on the way they have and the situation isn't going to hold. Could crisis be an opportunity for breakthrough, not just breakdown? Can we learn about each other and ourselves as a community through crisis? Can we see crisis as an opportunity to judge a situation and ourselves carefully, not just react with panic and confusion or turn things over to the authorities? So, crisis is viewed differently in different cultures, something that may be seen as so crisis is defined differently in different cultures. I know that the first time I had the onset of psychosis as a hoodoo, it was seen as its own spiritual event that was happening. And it was seen as something that needed its own repair spiritually, but wasn't necessarily viewed as psychosis. So it's important to understand that different people may be approaching crisis with different definitions. I definitely agree with this idea that crisis isn't always a breakdown. I'm thinking about in tarot, for example, the card of death. Sometimes things have to change, right? Sometimes we're going through just a division from one stage of our life to the next. But how you approach crisis, what that means to you, and the support you need is just individual. I just want to add that when we talk about crisis, it's important to think about the fact that for many people, crisis is a point at which um, your family members, somebody in your life may decide to call the police. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that because that's a process that I'm trying to interrupt as somebody who has survived from having the police called on me when I have been thought to be in crisis. I wanted to get into advanced directives. Advanced directives, particularly psychiatric advanced directives or PADs, are actually new. Advanced directives are more common for physical health. So when we're thinking about these descriptions of PADs, it's really important to remember that your rights are going to vary by which state you're in. I know that I'm in New York, so my rights will be different when it comes to PADs. So it's important to use the resources at the end of this presentation to figure out what your rights are by state. This is just general guidance. Psychiatric advance directives, PADs, are a specific type of advance directives, a legal document that allows a person to state what they want to happen with medical treatment and who they want to make decisions for them in advance of a crisis. Any adult who has the quote unquote capacity to make healthcare decisions and is acting of their own free will may make an advance directive. Capacity means the person's ability to understand a decision's consequences and to make and communicate the decision. A PAD details a peer's individual living with mental health conditions, preferences for future mental health treatment, and/or assigns an individual as a medical proxy to make treatment decisions if the person is in crisis and unable to do so. In California, I don't know how many of y'all are in California, a PAD can include the appointment of an agent for healthcare and individual healthcare instructions. Peers can complete one or both parts of the PAD, and either part is legally binding by itself. If the peer decides to appoint an agent, they have the right to limit the agent's power. The agent must make decisions in the way the peer would have themselves substituted judgment and cannot authorize treatment over the peer's objection. So this is important because you want to get ready by having an advance directive. It's optional, but you may want to get ready by having an advance directive if you know you have a serious, if you know that you have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness, or if you maybe relate to some of those symptoms, because this could be the difference between how you're treated, which facilities you go to, who can make decisions for you. And when we're dealing with increased, militarization of the police and increased police presence in our society, you want to be ready for what can happen. So it's just a way to be prepared. It's optional, but we're going to go over an example later in this presentation of a very simple psychiatric advance directive. And there's just a bit more information, especially under the resource list, of really going through a PAD that is more legally protected. So PADs have three primary components. While peers can choose to complete either one of the first two components or both, the third component must be completed for legal validation. So although, again, advanced directives are so new that whether or not they're legally binding is going to depend on your state and depend on your circumstances, but this is additional protection to help. So it's really important to look at the third part, signature pages. Designation of a healthcare agent or power of attorney for healthcare. This enables the peer to name a healthcare agent. An agent is responsible for making healthcare decisions for the person with substituted judgment should they lose the ability to make these decisions. In my situation, I would actually assign my mother as my healthcare agent. She's known me across my life. We're still in active relationship, and she knows the most about my mental health history. She's been in therapy with me. I feel like she could advocate for me. Individual healthcare instructions. This enables the peer to write specific instructions about the care and treatment they would want in certain situations. This could cover both physical and mental health treatment. So if you're in the disabled community, even if you're not, you may, be dealing with different conditions of physical health where an advanced directive is helpful for you. And this general guidance um, doesn't have to be negotiated by the state as much when it comes to physical health. Signature pages. In order to be valid, a PAD must have the peer signature, the date the PAD was made, and the signature of either two witnesses or acknowledgement by a notary public. And for a notary public, that may be an additional fee. So if it's more accessible, I would highly recommend the two witnesses. Peers should explain the reasons for their choices in the PAD as much as possible. The more they explain the reasoning behind their choices, the more difficult it will be for someone to argue that the peer lacked capacity when they wrote and signed the PAD. So understanding this is important because if you are having a case for your rights, just going back to this idea of capacity, I'm going to read it again. Capacity means the person's ability to understand a decision's consequences and to make and communicate the decision. Understanding this could be the key between navigating your own case if you're having to advocate for yourself that you were in, your best capacity to make these decisions. And I think it's just important to take the time to familiarize ourselves with the language. If this isn't clear to you upon a first read, I understand. And I think that it's important to understand it's not meant to be clear, right? We don't learn this in school. Having to navigate the system as people with serious mental illness or people who identify as MAD, however, we're identifying as disabled, as people who love people with those labels, however you're identifying, it's meant to be it's meant to be complicated. I want to get into psychiatric holds. I think that doing this research was incredibly helpful for me. I hope it's helpful for you as well. I looked at the rights of inpatients in New York State, where I live. Your rights are probably different depending on your state, but again, this is just for reference. And I think that one of the things that was most startling for me when looking at psychiatric holds was looking at the difference between Pennsylvania, where I used to live, and New York State, and being startled by just how easy it is to be under a psychiatric hold and for how much time one can be held. Informal admission occurs when someone requests treatment and is admitted without a formal or written application. If you are admitted under this status, you are free to leave at any time. I'm not going to read all of this, I'm just going to highlight. Voluntary admission occurs when someone who is 16 or older applies in writing for admission. If the person is under 18, the parent, legal guardian, custodian, or next of kin may have the authority to apply on the person's behalf. When we're thinking about support for people with serious mental illness or people living under that diagnosis, it's important to understand that when looking at the legality of things, family is considered some of the most important people in your life. So if you just have chosen family, this is where a psychiatric advance directive can be helpful because they're likely to ask to speak to your mother or somebody who they're considering a blood relative who's close to you. I had a situation where I was in the psych ward and I was actually sexually harassed by a psychiatrist there. And in advocating for myself, I asked to have a different psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist was obviously the colleague of the previous psychiatrist. And he told me that I could not go home, that if I was actually sexually harassed, I needed to stay at the hospital longer. And when I insisted that I want to see a different psychiatrist, I know my experience, I've documented everything. He suddenly said that in order for me to go home in the next couple of days, I needed somebody who could actually prove that I had been a teacher. He was put into question that I was a public school teacher. So he said I needed somebody from my family to prove that I was actually a public school teacher and that it wasn't a delusion. So that was a process I had to go through. So it's important to understand how important family, blood family, is considered to the system. Involuntary hospitalization is the legal process by which a person is confined in a psychiatric hospital because of a treatable mental disorder against their own wishes. So again, I'm not going to read all of this because this is going to be available for you to keep, but just going through the types of involuntary admissions in New York State from the rights of inpatients in New York State. There's medical certification, which requires that two physicians examine a person and certify that he or she needs involuntary care and treatment in a psychiatric facility. What I want to highlight about this is that if you're involuntarily admitted on the basis of a medical certificate, you can be kept in a psychiatric center for up to 60 days in New York State. This was shocking for me to hear. And it's as simple as two physicians. A lot of us who are disabled know about navigating experiences with physicians. They're not always honest. There's not necessarily anything foolproof about somebody being a physician. But knowing that it's as simple as that, and 60 days in a psychiatric center is just very startling to me to hear that that's happening in New York State. The second kind of involuntary admission is certification by a director of community services or an examining physician designated by the director of community services. This means being examined within the first 72 hours by a staff psychiatrist, which, if you're being held involuntarily, 72 hours is a long time. And then, based on the decision, you can still be kept for 60 days. The last kind is emergency admission based on the claim that the person has a mental illness which is likely to result in serious harm to self or others, and for which immediate observation, care, and treatment in a psychiatric center is appropriate. If you're admitted this way, you must be examined within 48 hours. You can be kept for up to 15 days. This has been my situation most often when staying at the psych ward. Um, my experience in Pennsylvania is that it hasn't had to have been up to 15 days. This is just an example for your reference of a guide to involuntary treatment holds, and this is for California. So just to see the full gamut, there's, individual unwilling, unable to accept voluntary treatment. It escalates to danger to self, dangers to others, or grave disability. Willing and able to accept voluntary treatment, 72-hour hold, all the way up to permanent LPS conservatorship of 1 year. And we're going over this so that we can understand what's at stake. Understanding the stakes of the clinical definitions related to severe mental illness allows us to prepare for the reality of living under that label within the system, even if we reject specific identities, terms, symptoms, experiences, or paradigms. So just highlighting that we're going through this so that we have the capacity, hopefully the improved capacity to navigate these systems. Serious mental illness is a marginalized, having trouble talking this evening. Serious mental illness is a marginalization. It's important to note this. This needs a slide of its own because I think a lot of people don't realize just how much it pushes you to the margins to have a serious mental illness. And I'm going to get into some examples of that. Okay, let me just move this over. And I definitely would love for people to share in the chat if they want, but definitely when we get to the end about their own struggles, if they live with serious mental illness or under that diagnosis. But here are just some examples. Because of the fluctuations of our symptoms, it can be hard to achieve stability. I know with me, with bipolar disorder, I have weeks where I'm more alert, ready to get stuff done, handling my to-do list. I have times where I can't sleep and I'm manic and I'm restless. I have times where I'm depressed and I can't get out of bed. And that lack of stability is one of the reasons why it's hard for me to maintain a regular employment. I've had trouble in grad school. It's basically one of the hardest aspects of my life. We are less likely to be believed because we are considered less rational. This can be dangerous in terms of police interference. All someone has to do from the definitions we see is identify us as having serious mental illness. That can lead to an involuntary hold. And also just, as we hear bipolar as an adjective for somebody who has mood swings, it's so easy for people to make personal attacks that are based in mental illness or to say things like crazy to discredit us, and that's extremely harmful. Medication changes can totally upend our lives. I believe that the first time I went into psychosis, it was from taking SSRIs, antidepressants, and being misdiagnosed for years as having major depressive disorder, not knowing that I was bipolar. But even if you're on a medication and you have a medication change, or if you, for example, partake in drugs that are harmful to your medication or your status, these things can cause crisis states. As I mentioned for my own case, many people are actually put on SSRIs, antidepressants, who are bipolar, and that does send them into psychosis. Experiencing psychosis can lead to police violence, even when family members call the police on us out of what they consider to be love or even fear. So this is a common experience for people not just with serious mental illness, but other people who are neurodiverse as well. This has happened to me on more than one occasion. Let me just make sure I'm interacting with the chat. Over here, nodding and snapping to all of this, Ty. Thank you. And I hope that people can share their own experiences, people who may experience psychosis as well. It's important, it's radical, it's disability justice. for us to simply say our stories. Particularly, I can say as a survivor of police brutality, it's so important for us to say our stories, to say the names of the people who have been killed by the police, and to highlight that there are alternatives to police interference. All right, so if you're Black, I'm sure you've heard a lot. Stay ready so you don't have to get ready. It's not hypervigilance, it's staying vigilant in a world that wants to destroy us. Guiding questions. How can preparation and planning for crisis states benefit the lives of those of us living under the diagnosis of serious mental illness? Are there any approaches that can ease the experience of crisis? I just check the chat. Me too, in particular, the long involuntary inpatient stay after two psychiatrists. Ali says, Flo says, woo, woo, yes, stay ready so you don't have to get ready. That is something to live by. And I hope that if you are not familiar with the saying, you can live by it because it is key to navigating the system. Don't wait for the system to teach you. Let's combat the system. Let's survive. Let's persist. Damn the systems. So the explanation, knowing what to expect, including which resources to gather beforehand and which conversations to have in advance, can be a great asset for those of us living under the diagnosis of serious mental illness and the people who love us. Two, expanding our understanding of crisis and widening our options beyond the carceral state can ease the experience of crisis. So can interacting with our preferred institutions. So I'm going to get more into this in the other slides, but let's normalize having conversations before we need to, right? As marginalized people, as Black, Indigenous people of color, let's have these conversations before the police get involved, before someone's life is in danger, before there's crisis. It's an asset for us all. And I'm here to kind of prompt how those conversations are taking place to get you prepared. And again, knowing which resources to gather beforehand, having this resource and access to this presentation afterwards will already be a start, to you gathering resources. So you're not going through this alone. We're in this together. Okay, so my suggested strategy is leverage to facilitate. I don't know a different way to put this that you'll remember it, but I don't know, L to F. I have to figure that out, but leverage to facilitate. All right, so we're going to leverage, for example, CRIP wisdom, lived experience, and survival strategies to facilitate advocacy, community supports, and care networks. So when we're talking about CRIP wisdom, we're talking about the wisdom that you have from navigating these systems as a disabled person, confronting ableism, all of that, your lived experience, whatever you've come to know in your experience, in your specific identities, how you have lived, how you have navigated things historically, right? As well as survival strategies. How have you made it this far? And honestly, if you're living with serious mental illness, if you're a person who is marginalized, we have to snap up the fact that you have made it this far, right? And that's the point of this presentation. We're going to keep making it. We're going to keep surviving together. So using all of that together, my bad, right, to facilitate advocacy. We're not just going to let things happen to us. We're going to take a stand about what's going on, and we're going to get the best of what these systems offer. Community supports, different things in your community. We're going to talk about respite care. We're going to talk about supportive housing, whatever is available in your community. Depending on how you're living your life, I take voice lessons. Voice lessons can be a community support. It is helping me to stay alive, to get outside of my house, to do something creative. So we can also change the way we view community supports and care networks, the people who come together and the ways in which they help us persist. Discussing experiences with mental illness with people in our lives. With providers, you can emphasize the needs that can be met with medical help and official paperwork. Family, you can emphasize the needs that can be met by having various kinds of support outside of the system and someone to speak on your behalf within the system. With friends, you can emphasize social support needed, how friends can be active members of your care network, and and make friends aware of anti-carceral approaches. Additional supports, see if there are additional opportunities to receive support that can fill in the gaps where your needs are not currently being met. As I mentioned, for me, an additional support is having voice lessons. Talking with providers about mental illness. Providers are often seen as the most official members of our teams, meaning that we often have to compromise with them to get urgent needs met, regardless of how well they understand our situation. This is why it's important to establish a rapport with providers before reaching a crisis state, if possible. And these are some things that can help you establish a rapport and get the information you want to get to the doctors. Utilize I statements with an emotional appeal to personalize the difficulties you face. For example, Dr. So and so, thank you for taking the time to meet me. It is so hard for me to get to appointments on time when I'm dealing with mania and I'm unable to sleep. Make sure they understand how much effort you put forth to take care of your health. This goes into the, idea of being a good patient. Although we don't want to give in to respectability politics, in trying to be as effective as we can and get what we need from these doctors, doctors are going to help you more if they believe that you're putting in an effort. And if you're trying to get paperwork for disability benefits, for example, sometimes it makes things go along more smoothly if you assert that you're doing everything in your power to take care of your health. Use examples from your life to clarify the impact of specific actions, choices, and changes. You can approach your psychiatrist saying, when I don't get an answer about medication changes in time, it is harmful when I'm trying to prepare my work for the weekend. Ask clarifying questions as much as possible. Make sure you know what's going on. Give ample time for paperwork to be completed. If it usually takes doctors, especially after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, it takes doctors even longer to get paperwork back. So if you have essential paperwork, even if you can get it in a month in advance, it can be very helpful. Review your visit summaries and documentations. This goes along with knowing what's going on. Find out what your doctors, especially psychiatrists, are writing about in your visit summaries. And if you have any concerns, you can bring them up. Talking with family about mental illness. Family, whether chosen or biological, are sometimes the first people to become aware of our crisis states. They may be emergency contacts for providers as well. Family members can be our greatest allies against the utilization of purely carceral approaches to crisis states. So it's a great idea to get them on board as early as possible. You can do this by clarifying the differences between how things may seem externally versus how they are happening for you internally. For example, one's anxiety can make them quieter and more quieter and turn inward, but that doesn't mean that you're upset, right? It can help to let your family know it may look like this. I may look angry, and I am angry, but it's because of my anxiety. It's hard for people to understand what you're going through if you don't explain it. Explain to them how providers and systems have helped and failed you. This goes along with your advanced directive. Let them know. Um, and my next point, make them aware of any providers or institutions you never wish to return to. If your family is having to choose where to take you in a crisis state, if they're not aware of where you never want to go, what's dangerous for you, or what's happened to you, it's hard for them to make decisions that are in your best interest. When you're in these psychiatric facilities, once those doors close, oftentimes people don't actually know what happens. So it's important for us to communicate clearly about these experiences and let them know which providers you love, where you've been helped. Explain which approaches have helped you the most and which approaches you would like adopted in the future. My family knows I love DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. I've been in DBT group before. I'm back in DBT group. That helps me when needing to turn to my family for support. People can advocate best when they're informed. Talking with friends, and I'll get to the chat in a minute. Talking with friends about mental illness. Friends may struggle to show up for us when our signs of mental illness are presenting with more severity. Some friendships benefit most when the person in need can directly state how to help them in times of crisis. So be honest about your needs and capacity. If you can't show up, if you can't make an event, if you're not going to be answering text messages, again, having these conversations in advance can be very helpful. Discuss what your good, bad, and standard days are like. It's really important to be clear about this because for some people with chronic illness, a good day is dealing with a lot of pain, for example. It's really important to differentiate what these days are like because it's hard for other people to know. This varies from person to person. What I'm capable of doing in a manic episode is not what someone else is capable of doing. Discuss how treatment is going. Follow up with the people you trust about how your treatment's doing. Make a list of friends who are willing to be emergency contacts. This can be extremely important, especially for people in the LGBTQ community, where we rely more on chosen family. Make sure you have people who can be your emergency contacts because that's the person that's going to be contacted by the hospital, your therapist, your psychiatrist, and you need people who you can rely on for that. Make friends aware of where you're at in your journey. That's just, keeping everyone informed. If you need more support, it's important to articulate that. I know that when we're in episodes, we may not be the best at communicating. So again, you want to do these things before and, just try your best. Do what you can. Okay. I want to get to the chat, but we also have to move forward. So I'm gonna actually have to check the chat at the end. Excuse me, my allergies. Okay, preparing for 72 hours or more in a psychiatric hospital. This is the advice I have from 10 years of experience. Research psychiatric hospitals in your area and even the next area over. Wealthier areas sometimes have nicer psychiatric facilities with more humane practices that allow for more patient autonomy. When I lived in Pennsylvania, I would have to raise mutual aid to take a 45-minute ride, Uber ride, just to get to the best psychiatric hospital in the area. I did that plenty of times. That can really be the difference between the quality of your stay. Make sure your cell phone contact list is up to date. Oftentimes, you will be allowed to get the most important contact information on your phone once at the start of your stay. Some hospitals will let you go more than once, but they're usually not very patient with that. You want to have your contact list up to date because they're definitely not going to let you go through different devices. If you don't have a number in your contact list, but you have one main number, for example, I have my mother's number memorized. You can call that person when you have access to the phone at the psych ward and ask them to give you other people's phone numbers or message people on your behalf. Pack comfortable clothes that you enjoy wearing, or see if someone else can bring you your comfiest clothes. Psych wards typically only provide hospital gowns, and it can feel awkward to wear them beyond the first day. Any way you can increase comfort during your stay will make a difference. Some psych wards will also allow you to have Amazon packages shipped directly to you, so see if somebody else can order them for you. Here's some more advice. Bring along a notebook and pens or pencils for journaling or drawing if desired, but most importantly, to document your stay. Keep track of diagnoses, conversations with psychiatrists and social workers, medication changes, and anything else that's concerning that takes place. Read the rights and responsibilities packet carefully. Retain your copy and ask questions about anything you were unclear about. You are legally obligated to receive a copy of the patient's rights and responsibilities, and someone should go over this packet with you. Beware of the previous point and take note of any violations you experience. When advocating for yourself, you can reference this packet. I have the information packet for New York State's rights that I already referenced and available in the resource list. Ask to speak with a patient advocate if anything concerning takes place. It can be especially hard to advocate for yourself during a psychiatric stay, but the patient advocate has to speak with you within 24 hours in most cases. This can be the fastest way to receive help. You can also escalate it by asking to speak with the director. Ask to file a complaint if needed. This goes along with documenting everything. Be sure to fill out an official complaint and request to keep a copy for yourself, although they should automatically provide you with one. Complaints typically have to be addressed within a specific amount of time. Try to be on friendly terms with those around you. Psychiatric stays can be lonely and typically lead us to feel more isolated because we are. Making friends around us, even temporarily, can help us to feel safer and more comfortable and can help the time pass. There are sometimes games available. These are people who can watch your back, people who can give you advice. I once had someone in a psych ward suggest the current medication I'm on. He told me that Latuda was one of the best medications for bipolar disorder, and he suggested it, and I've been on it for years. Okay, I know we're coming to the end, so we're going to have to cut the question segment a bit shorter, possibly. Planning for short-term alternatives to a psych hospitalization. So if you don't want to go to the hospital, there are many reasons to not want to have a psych hospitalization. Or if you just want to have a different way of dealing with crisis, these are some short-term suggestions. One, meet your needs. Taking care of physical needs such as thirst, hunger, and emotional urges and discomfort. Check HALT to start. HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. It's best to treat those things first before you get kind of deeper into looking at being in a crisis state. Sometimes you just really need to eat. Medication changes, see your psychiatrist, medical professional, herbalist, etc. for support with changing the medication or medication alternatives you have been taking according to your concerns. Medication changes can cause crisis states. More frequent appointments, seeing your therapist and or psychiatrist more often than usual to offer more support or even to allow them to keep closer tabs on your state and needs. Sometimes a therapist is willing to have more appointments rather than take a more extreme approach, or a psychiatrist is willing to see you in 2 weeks or demands to see you in 2 weeks rather than a month to keep tabs on you. More frequent check-ins and visits. Other people in your life can offer support in the form of interacting with you more often, be it in person or online. Making time for them to ask how you're doing more often can help keep things from escalating. Stay at respite. Respite is a peer-managed stay at a specific site for mental health support for an allotted amount of time, sometimes 1 to 2 weeks. You may be able to petition for a longer stay. Stay with a trusted person. If your friends or family are willing to help, you can stay with others who can assist in your care until you are more stable. Sometimes that's a major help. You may not need to go to the hospital, but you may need to get out of your immediate environment. This is the last major slide before questions. Supportive housing, a long-term support. I am in supportive housing, and it is actually the situation that got me out of homelessness. So I do highly suggest it, although it does involve navigating some parts of the system. Supportive housing is a permanent housing program for those diagnosed with serious mental illness. It's on site at a scatter site or in independent housing. In my housing, I have a lease. I rent an apartment that was available on the market, so it's independent. The level of care is contingent upon your designated capacity. Sometimes there's supportive housing where you have a roommate who also has serious mental illness. Sometimes you're in a house, a more group home setting, and it can be individual as well. Supportive housing is subsidized and subsidized and often offered to folks on SSD or SSI. So having disability can help you qualify. This is just a resource you can look at later. It's a simple advanced directive. It hasn't been signed, so it wouldn't be great for legality, but just gives you an idea of some of my preferences. All right, we're at the Q&A. All right, awesome. Please reach out to me. If I can be a support for you, please let me know. I'm glad that these resources help. Please review this presentation, review the wonderful resources. Thank you so much.